So at ASCO 2020, we had presentation of the highly anticipated ADAURA data sets. This is a randomized phase 3 trial looking at 3 years of adjuvant osimertinib in EGFR mutant patients who had a complete resection and had chemotherapy if it was indicated, or not, even if it was indicated, compared to just standard of care. And the primary endpoint was disease-free survival. Patients with stage 1B, 2, and 3A were recruited, and the primary endpoint was disease-free survival. Now, we knew it was a positive study, but the extent of the magnitude of disease-free survival seen, I think, took a lot of people by surprise. Certainly did for me. The overall hazard ratio seen in the primary endpoint population, which is stage 2 and 3A, resected non-small cell lung cancer, was 0.17. I mean, this is a phenomenal disease-free survival hazard ratio. And the key issue here is this enough to change practice? There are many questions that we still need to know. What was the extent of resection in the patients? How well staged were they prior to having their resection? Do they all have MRI or brain imaging to make sure no intracranial disease? What happens to these patients when they get followed up? What's the progression-free survival? Where do they relapse? One of the issues is we know that these drugs have a benefit in progression-free survival or disease-free survival. That's not new. We've seen that in randomized data. We've seen that in single-arm data. The really disappointing thing from one of the original studies, the RADIANT trial, was that patients who had adjuvant erlotinib in that trial had a higher rate of intracranial relapse when they did relapse. Are we going to say the same thing again with ADAURA? These are the sorts of information we need to know. Now, clearly, overall survival is the most meaningful endpoint in an adjuvant study. Does it make people live longer? Does it increase the cure rate? But we're going to have to wait a long time to know that. And the big debate that's ongoing at the moment is the magnitude of disease-free survival that we're seeing here, hazard ratio 0.17, big enough to make this standard of care whilst awaiting the perhaps 4 years it will take to get an overall survival output for this. And therein lies the problem. Now, there are many debaters pro and con for this, and you can decide how you want to sit, in which camp you want to sit. I think if the hazard ratio had been 0.7 or 0.8 or 0.6 or even 0.5, most people would say, okay, that's interesting, but we need overall survival. But when you've got a hazard ratio of 0.17, that really is a spectacularly strong benefit. Now, we have a number of other problems. The trial was closed. The trial was reported early, and with an early reporting trial, you always have an inflated hazard ratio. So the true hazard ratio for DFS is probably less than 0.17. And of course, if these patients are now unblinded, it may well influence how their overall survival is going to impact in the future. So the fact that the trial was so positive, it led to early unblinding, has undoubtedly influenced the longer-term data picture that we'll have. And that's just one of the problems that we have with early disclosure of data in positive data sets. So there are so many unknowns about this study. The purists will say, no, we must wait for overall survival. Those that are believers will say, no, this is a spectacular disease-free survival benefit. This is now a standard of care. Personally, I think the magnitude of difference we've seen here is spectacular, and I think it's difficult to explain to patients why you would want to withhold this treatment. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this needs to be proved cost-effective in a healthcare economy that commissions drugs by cost-effectiveness. And it would be very difficult to prove cost-effectiveness on the data that we have at the moment. So I think maybe difficulties ahead with the typical cost effectiveness data that NICE would need to see to make this commissioned. But undoubtedly in healthcare economies where that's not an issue, I can see this becoming a rapidly adopted standard of care. And interestingly, we have data in GIST tumors, which are driven by KIT mutation, showing that 3 years of adjuvant imatinib are associated with a survival advantage, and that data has only now recently been published. So perhaps this is a very similar situation. We still have many uncertainties before we feel completely comfortable with that, but early adopters undoubtedly will jump into the pool of adjuvant osimertinib.